If you're anything like me, you've probably been hearing the term block bet as part of poker strategy for a very long time. But like a lot of other concepts, it's very easy to use this term without having a clear understanding of what exactly it means. And many players end up employing block bet strategies without being clear on why they're doing it. In this video, we'll correct some of these issues. Before we dive into the video, please take the time to go ahead and like the video and subscribe to our channel. It helps us keep bringing you high-quality strategy content on a regular basis. Thanks. Hi Wizards, I'm Matt Hunt, and this video is going to be all about the theory behind block bets. This is a complex topic, so we're going to tackle it from as many different angles as possible in order for you to get a full perspective. However, there are some restrictions in how we're going to define our terms, which I'll explain shortly. To start with, let's establish what we're referring to when we talk about a block bet. First and foremost, we're referring to small bet sizes, usually anywhere around 35% of the pot or less, but sometimes as small as 10% or even 5% of the pot. While it wouldn't necessarily be incorrect to use the term to describe a small bet on any street, it's primarily used to describe bets made on the river, since these bets tend to serve a different, more specific purpose than small bets made on earlier streets. For that reason, we're exclusively going to be discussing small bets made on the river in this video. In addition, we're only going to be focusing on bets made from out of position. This is for the very simple reason that small bets from in position on the river don't tend to occur at equilibrium. The downside of reopening the betting action and potentially getting raised is almost always greater than whatever additional EV we might gain from betting small relative to checking and seeing a showdown. This forms the basis of our most fundamental principle regarding block bets, which is that we should not use block bets from in position on the river. This video is also not going to cover block bets which fall into the category of donk bets. In other words, any bet from out of position in a spot where we check-called the previous street. In order to discuss these spots, we would have to dive into the theory behind donk betting, which is a very big topic and is best covered in a separate video. Watch out for that one in future. With that said, let's discuss some of the most common misconceptions about block bets, since it's important to address a few of those before we fully dive into the theory. Let's start with a simple true or false question for you all. Feel free to pause the video for a moment if you need some time to think about the answer. True or false? Block bets are made primarily because our specific hand does not want to check and face a bet from our opponent. Think about this one for a second. Hopefully you have your answer by now, so let's discuss it. The answer is false, as many of you might have imagined. However, the theory behind block bets is actually a lot more complex than this, and you may be surprised to learn that there is actually a small grain of truth behind this concept, which we'll discuss later on when we look at range construction. In fact, there are several different common misconceptions about block betting which all contain a small grain of truth, despite the fact that they would generally be bad advice to follow. For example, the idea that block betting is only done with middle-strength hands, the idea that it's done with the specific intent of inducing our opponent to raise, or conversely, the idea that we're usually intending to fold to a raise when we do it. Each of these ideas individually is incorrect, but they are all grounded in some kind of approximation of what the theory behind block betting actually looks like, and we'll tackle each of those grains of truth in a few minutes. For now though, let's focus on some of the primary theory concepts which will help us in understanding how block bets function. The first of these ideas relates to the ranges which are usually in play when we arrive at a block bet scenario. The idea of depolarized equity distributions. I have another question for all of you. More of a challenge, really. The following slide is going to contain 4 images representing the equity distribution graphs of 4 different river situations. Your job here is to establish which and how many of these 4 graphs, if any, represents a spot where the out of position player block bets more than 30% of their range. Not an easy question, I know, but try to think of it more in terms of which graphs represent situations where block betting might be a good play for the out of position player. This exercise should help you to get more comfortable thinking in terms of equity distributions. Are you ready? Good. Then here are the graphs. So, did you figure it out? Well, it was a little bit of a trick question actually, because the answer is all of them. All 4 of these spots are situations I pulled from the GTO Wizard archive where block betting was happening at a rate somewhere between 30% and roughly 90% of the time. They're actually all drawn from vastly different scenarios too. The top 2 graphs are MTT spots at 2 different stack sizes, and the bottom 2 are cash game spots. They're also from 4 different betting lines. Top left is from a spot where the out of position player bets both flop and turn in a 3-bet pot. Top right is where the pre-flop raiser bets the flop out of position and then the turn checks through. Bottom left is a spot where the big blind check raises and gets called and then the turn checks through. And bottom right is a 4-bet pot where action checks all the way to the river. What you can see from all these graphics is that none of them represent traditional polarized range versus bluff-catching range distributions. Top left is a very unusual one in that it represents a spot where the outer position range is very linear, with almost all hands having more than 50% equity. This was actually the spot with the most block betting too. The other spots are all ones where the equity distributions run somewhat closer together, and both players possess ranges containing a lot of different types of hands. The best way to describe these scenarios is simply to refer to these distributions as depolarized. Distinguishing polarized from depolarized scenarios is an important skill, but thankfully it's not especially difficult. The biggest determining factor is almost always going to be how many bets go in post-flop. The more one player puts in multiple bets across multiple streets, the more their range begins to polarize, while the more the other player just calls instead of folding or raising, the more their range begins to condense towards bluff catchers. This creates the traditional polar range versus bluff catcher dynamic that I mentioned earlier. However, when fewer bets go in, both players' ranges retain a broader spectrum of equity. They still possess some middle strength hands and some weaker hands, along with a small amount of slow-played strong hands, while many of the middle hands will also increase in equity on various turn cards. This dynamic will tend to create situations where small bet sizings are very useful for the out-of-position player on many runouts. It allows them to apply pressure to the weaker hands in the in-position range for a cheap price. And in many cases, it will allow for some very thin value bets as well. But there's also one other really big benefit to block bet sizings on the river in particular, something I'll refer to as range manipulation. You'll have to bear with me a little on the name of this concept. It does sound a little more like one of those wishy-washy exploitative terms from 2003, but I promise it is more theory-based than it sounds. So what is range manipulation? Well, it's not about manipulating our opponent, it's actually about manipulating our own ranges. When we arrive at the river out of position, or really on any street out of position, but we're focused on the river here, we have to recognize that anytime we have a betting range, that range affects our checking range, and vice versa. In turn, the nature of our checking range affects the in-position player's options. Their optimal strategy will be vastly different against a very strong checking range compared to a very weak one. Remember that we're always trying to keep villain indifferent between options, and the EV of every option will change dramatically for our opponent if we change the nature of the range they're playing against. If our checking range is too strong, it becomes easier for them to simply check behind, see a showdown, and realize their equity with most of their range. While the top of our range will be less likely to get value since it's less likely to face a bet in the first place and have the opportunity to check raise. If our checking range is too weak, we're very vulnerable to being attacked by the in-position player, both with thin value bets and a higher rate of bluffs as a direct result of this wider value bet range. If, for example, our range is so weak that our opponent can overbet any second pair or better for value, then they're going to be able to fire out a lot of bluffs as well, and this puts a lot of our bluff catchers in really bad spots. But this, at least in part, is where block betting comes in. Block betting serves as a way for us to effectively alter the nature of our checking range without paying a significant price to do so. In some cases, paying the minimum price of one big blind. We're creating an extra node in the game tree, which isn't substantially different from the node next to it where we check, but it's different enough that it allows us to make slightly more money at the checking node. To show you a little more of what I mean, here's an example spot that I ran through a solver myself with a slightly simplified river game tree. It's a 50 big blind tournament spot where the hijack bets half pot on 10-9-5 two-tone against hero in the big blind, gets called, and then the turn jack checks through. The river is the queen of hearts, completing both flushes and straights. In this spot, when I only gave hero the option to check or bet full pot, hero was forced to check roughly 3/4 of our range. After we check, in position checks back just over 63% of the time. I only allowed in position to bet full pot here just for simplicity, but their value bet threshold for that sizing is the queen high straight. A small amount of 8x was betting for value on this river. When I added a block bet sizing of 10% of the pot for us here, it improved our EV by 0.05 big blinds, which equates to 5 big blinds per 100. A pretty decent sized gain for a tiny bet. What it also did was drastically reduce our checking frequency from 76% to 54%. This, in turn, allowed villain to bet 1.3% more often when checked to. That doesn't seem like a huge change, but consider the other variable here. Villain's value bet threshold is now top 2 pair. They've started betting Queen-Jack for value sometimes. It might not seem like a good thing that we've allowed villain to value bet thinner, but in fact what we've done is increase the rate at which we cause them to be indifferent. Previously, Queen-Jack was a clear check back, but it's now at the point where it's indifferent between betting and checking, so we're actually achieving our goal of indifference more efficiently here. When I added another block bet sizing of 30% of the pot, the EV went up even further by another 0.07 big blinds, or 7 big blinds per 100. So all things considered, we gained 12 big blinds per 100 in EV by adding 2 different block bet options here, which is a very significant gain. We could probably simplify this to one block bet sizing of 20% pot and capture most of that EV gain, but we can't get that extra EV without some kind of block bet sizing here. Let's now return to that concept of indifference because it's crucial to this next aspect of block bet theory. This concept is something that I'm referring to as double indifference or even triple indifference. What does this mean? Well, to explain it, we first have to make sure we correctly understand the concept of indifference in polarized spots. In a polarized spot, as the outer position bluff-catching player, we're trying to keep villain's bluffs indifferent between bluffing and checking, or as close to it as possible. We're also trying to ensure that villain's value bets don't gain massively from one sizing compared to another. We need to have hands in our range which can defend against any possible sizing. Most of the time, this just requires calling and folding at the right frequencies with the right hands, because we have no reason to do the betting ourselves when our opponent is polarized, and we're usually facing an all-in bet, meaning there's no raising which can happen. However, in block bet spots, we're very often dealing with much higher SPRs, because not very much betting action has occurred. We're also dealing with wider ranges containing a broad spectrum of combos. What this means is that in depolarized spots where block betting often occurs, the in-position player will usually have a lot of hands which are very close versus a small bet size. They have just enough equity that they can consider calling because they're getting such a good price. However, the player will also want to have enough bluffs in their raising range that sometimes these hands will be tempted to turn into bluffs as well. A tough decision for our opponent. In fact, we'll see that some hands will occasionally have all 3 options available to them versus a block bet sizing: folding, calling to bluff catch, and raising as a bluff. They're indifferent in 2 directions at once because they have 3 options which are all very close in EV. In addition, because we manipulated our checking range by including a block bet sizing in our strategy, those same hands will also be indifferent between checking to showdown and bluffing versus our checking range. This creates a third form of indifference, and we reach the point where our opponent really has no easy options against anything we do. Here's an example of what I mean. It's the same spot as we previously looked at, and we're focusing on pocket 7s in the villain's range. If we block bet for 12% pot, a hand like 7 of hearts, 7 of spades is indifferent between all 3 options: folding, calling, and raising. In fact, it's even indifferent between the 2 possible raise sizing options as well. In addition, 7 of hearts, 7 of spades is mostly indifferent between checking and betting if we check. It is betting most of the time, but it's splitting between 4 different sizings. The presence of a block bet strategy for us here has put pocket 7s in a lot of difficult spots. Even the combos without a heart are indifferent between calling and folding versus the block bet, despite the fact that they have a clear check back if we check. So we can see from all this that there are a few different things that block betting helps us to accomplish in any given spot. But what about the grain of truth that I mentioned before about each of those common misconceptions? Well, let's take a deeper dive into this same spot we've been using as our example to discuss what I mean. So we can see from all this that there are a few different things that block betting helps us to accomplish in any given spot. But what about the grain of truth that I mentioned before about each of those common misconceptions? Well, let's take a deeper dive into this same spot we've been using as our example to discuss what I mean. First, let's look at the core misconception, that we block bet because we don't want to check and face a bet. While this idea is very flawed overall, since we certainly shouldn't build our strategy around the idea of trying to avoid a specific scenario, there is a grain of truth to it. And it all comes down to the idea of increasing the price of our opponent's aggression. Take a look at this graphic to see what I mean. If we check, our opponent is facing an unopened pot, and as a result, the amount of chips they have to risk in order to make a bet of a certain percentage of the pot is relatively easy to figure out. When we block bet, even for the 12% sizing, the level of risk our opponent takes on in order to raise our bet increases in a non-linear fashion. As you can see, the price our opponent has to pay to make, for example, a pot size raise versus a 35% block bet is more than double the price they pay to make a pot-sized bet versus a check. While this wouldn't really affect the scenario that much if the SPR was very small and all the raises were all in, at this SPR of roughly 3.5, it does have an impact. It alters the price our opponent will be getting against a potential re-raise, and to at least some extent, restricts their ability to raise for thin value without risking overfolding to a re-raise. Another way to look at this is that we're getting a much better price to block bet and then 3-bet jam all in than we are to check and then check jam. This table here shows what I mean. If we check shove all in versus a half pot bet in this spot, we're shoving for roughly 1.5 times the pot. But if we block for 35% and then jam versus a half pot raise, we're only shoving for roughly 3/4 of the pot. This significantly alters the price our opponent is getting, as you can see, and it also gives us a better price on a bluff, since our alpha, the frequency our bluff has to get through in order to break even, is much lower. In addition, it forces villain to defend a much greater portion of their range in order to avoid overfolding. If they raise against a small bet, they're now forced to call our shove with 56% of their raising range, as opposed to only needing to call off with 40% of their betting range if they bet half pot once we check. These aren't numbers you need to be able to figure out in-game, but when breaking down the theory of complex spots, it's important to grasp why the solver does what it does. In this case, the initial small bet has many different benefits to it, but one of them is to alter the number of chips our opponent has to risk in order to be aggressive, and subsequently make it harder for them to be aggressive without allowing us a profitable rebluff. The next misconception, which does possess a grain of truth, is the idea that we only block bet with middle strength hands. We're going to use the same situation as an example here, only this time we're going to focus on the equity distributions of the ranges. Here's the graph showing the two ranges which arrive at this spot. Clearly, the big blind's range, the light blue line, possesses very few weak hands. By contrast, the hijack's range contains a lot of weak hands. The top of both ranges are relatively similar, the flushes and king-high straights, but the big blind doesn't possess any trash anymore because it all would have folded the flop. However, what's not intuitive here is that the block bet sizings from the big blind are actually targeting the weak portion of the hijack's range to make them indifferent, because these hands aren't absolute trash, but instead have perhaps 10 to 20% equity, and they're in some close spots versus a small bet. This produces the double or triple indifference I mentioned earlier. If we look at the big blind's strategy in this spot, we can see this in more detail. The simple equity buckets on the left show us that the smaller bet sizes here are not used by any weak hands at all. That's the 25 to 50% category on the right. In fact, the block sizings here are heavily composed of some fairly strong hands. In particular, the 60 to 70% equity region is almost exclusively using the block sizes. So it is actually true that the block sizings are largely made up of middle strength hands here. Only the definition of middle strength is mostly referring to hands which have between 50 and 80% equity, as opposed to pure bluff catchers or low equity combos. In addition, we should also note that there is some protection in the block sizings here, with some portion of the best hands also choosing to block, while there are also some bluffs as well. It's just that we can't bluff very much for this size because villain is folding very rarely. But nevertheless, while we're not block betting exclusively with middling hands, the very top and the very bottom of our range is more likely to use the bigger sizings or check. The third misconception, which has an element of accuracy, is the idea that we sometimes might block bet to induce a raise from our opponent. Now, personally, I think induce can be a very dangerous word in this game because it implies we can influence our opponent's decisions, so I try to avoid using this word. But it is common to hear players talk about block betting strong hands in the hope of a raise. The main reason why this thinking is flawed theoretically is because at equilibrium, our opponents will always bluff at the right frequencies, whether we bet or check. So we can't somehow persuade them to overbluff by block betting. However, the grain of truth contained within the concept relates to the idea that certain specific hands will prefer to block bet instead of checking, based on their individual card removal properties. Let's look at the same example again, except in this case I've highlighted two specific portions of the big blind's range. The non-nut flushes containing the 8 of hearts, and the nut flushes. Clearly, the former category is exclusively betting the smaller sizings in this spot, while the latter category is playing a pure check. I'm going to switch over to viewing the archive real quick just to show you guys something interesting using the blockers tab. Here we can see the node where the hijack is facing the 12% block sizing from the big blind, and we're focused on the frequencies rather than the sizings, so I've simplified to fold, call, and raise here. If we sort by which cards in the big blind's hand make the hijack more likely to raise, we can see that anytime we have pairs, clubs, or spades in our hand, it makes villain more likely to raise, which makes sense, since villain's raises contain a lot of flushes, and when we have those cards, they have more flushes. However, if we scroll down a little, we can actually see that the 8 of hearts is the only heart which actually increases villain's raising frequency, only by 0.13%, but it does mean an increase. by way of blocking a lot of their most frequent calls, which are the low end of the rivered straight. We can see that the 8x hands are almost exclusively playing a call here. They're never raising with 8x except for specifically the 8-6 of hearts, I believe that is. Yes, that's the 8-6 of hearts. You can also see that the jack of hearts has a fairly neutral impact on the raise frequency here, and all the other hearts, if we scroll down, actually reduce villains' raising frequency by quite a bit. In fact, when we block bet this river with the ace or the king of hearts, we get raised a full 2% less often. So in summary, the reason why the flushes containing the 8 of hearts specifically want to block bet, as you can see right here, is because they're the only flushes which actually stand a slightly better chance of getting raised based on card removal. Our other flushes, either the stronger ones or the weaker ones, all have card removal properties which make it less favorable to block bet them, and more favorable to either bet bigger or check, which unblocks all of our opponent's thin value raises and a lot of their bluff raises. We can, in a sense, induce a raise by block betting. The final grain of truth in the common logic around block betting is all about our response to a raise. The old approach here might have us block betting with the intent to fold our entire range to the raise, assuming our opponent only raises strong hands. Obviously, this is a mistake, since we should virtually never fold our entire range to a raise. But there is some truth to the idea that we have more leeway to fold to a raise after block betting than we do to fold to a bet after checking. It all comes down to what Tomboss explained in his recent article on the site, the idea of the initial better's advantage. Here's a table showing our minimum defense frequency against various bet and raise sizings the villain might use here. Our theoretical MDF is very easy to calculate once we check, but it becomes more tricky once we bet, since we have to incorporate our bet into the pot size when calculating villain's raise. The main trend here is that, as you can see, there's a gap between how much of our range we have to defend once we check in order to prevent villain's bluffs from profiting, and how much we have to defend once we block bet for the same reason. That gap gets smaller as our bet size increases, but even for the 12% bet size, we now get the luxury of defending our range a full 8% less often versus half pot, just for the low price of 1.5 big blinds. In essence, what we're doing here is using the block bet sizings to effectively buy ourselves the opportunity to fold slightly more often to villain's aggression. We're also purchasing a small amount of fold equity in the process, which is helpful as well, alongside all the other benefits we've already discussed. So now that we've broken down some of the common ideas about block bet strategies and separated fact from fiction, let's start thinking about the types of spots in which we might employ block bets as part of our strategy. To allow us to do this more effectively, I've broken these spots down into 5 categories of situations, each of which is relatively easily identifiable in-game. I've labeled them type A through E for simplicity. Type A spots are going to be scenarios where we take a polarized line, again from out of position, such as betting flop and turn, or check raising flop and betting turn, and then a river card arrives which changes the board dramatically. Type B is any spot where we are in a depolarized line as the turn aggressor. We check the flop out of position, villain checked behind, and we use the small bet sizing on the turn. Type C spots are similar, except we bet the flop from out of position and then the turn was checked through. Type D is where we check call the flop, usually versus an in-position C bet, and then the turn is checked through, so we retain all of our flop defending range through to the river. Finally, type E spots are the ones where there is no betting on either the flop or turn, and both players check all the way to the river. Let's break down each of these categories of spots and examine our usage of block bet strategies in these scenarios using the GTO Wizard archive. So let's start by looking at a type A spot. What I've done is I've picked out one from the archive. It's a 100 big blind tournament spot, 3-bet pot, small blind against hijack. Small blind is barreling off here, and as you can see, I've put together a makeshift river report since we don't yet have the ability to do river reports in the archive. And you can see I've focused on the smallest sizing here. And interestingly, there are quite a lot of rivers where this very small sizing of 10%, even in a polarized line, is actually used. If we look at where it's happening the most, it's primarily on cards that complete the straights. Not so much the flushes, because the flushes do affect the board in a slightly different way, given that the in-position player is going to have some flushes that the out-of-position player maybe won't have as often here. But the straight completing cards like the ace, the king, the 10 in particular, of the suits that are not clubs are going to have pretty heavy block bet tendencies here for the out-of-position player. And even some of the cards that are ostensibly almost a brick are still going to have a little bit of block betting. Even on a 4, an offsuit 4, there's still a small amount of block betting there. So let's pick out the card that has the most block betting here, which is the King of Diamonds, and just examine what that strategy looks like here. So here we have the spot pulled up, and in fact, what's very interesting about this scenario is that we focused on the smallest sizing of the 10%, but there's actually a lot of 35% here as well. And that goes to the extent that we're basically never checking in this spot. Now, it's not a high-frequency spot. There's not that many combos that get here, but it is worth noting that it's very easy for a spot like this to exist where out of position simply has the incentive to block bet almost all of their range here. And if we look at why that is, take a look at the equity distributions. Well, at the bottom here, you can see the out-of-position player has a lot of medium-strength hands, and in position has a lot of hands that are not necessarily pure garbage. They don't have zero equity, but they do have very, very little equity. This king completed a lot of hands. It made a lot of the small blind's bluffs improve to one pair. So as you can see, small blind doesn't have a lot of best hands, but they have a huge advantage in good hands. The in-position player actually has almost no good hands here. And then both players have a little bit of weak hands, and in-position just has a lot of trash. So in-position is slightly polarized, but the frequency of good hands is just so high for out-of-position that they're actually using a block size instead of checking. So it's a little bit like a spot where they would normally check and allow in-position to bluff with their trash and value bet their best hands, and then they would just bluff catch, except a lot of their hands are so strong they still want to get a little bit of value. And if we look at what the 10% sizing is targeting here, you can see what the portion of the in-position player's range is that's made indifferent by this size. And it's a lot of ace-jack, some ace-queen even, ace-jack, jack-9 suited, sometimes bluffing, sometimes folding. 8-7 is pretty close, 7-6 is pretty close with a bluff. So there's a lot of 7x that's close between bluffing and folding. There's a certain amount of jack-x that's close between calling and folding. So that's the region that's indifferent against this very small size here. So that's a type A spot. That's a spot where we're in a polarized line, and then the river changes the board to some degree, which essentially improves our bluffs, doesn't allow us to really have very much trash anymore. And it kind of becomes a spot where in position or our opponent has a lot of trash and some nut hands still. And so we're just sort of pushing the equity of that strong portion to get a little bit of very thin value, and then also give ourselves the ability to bluff catch against their jams. So that's how this spot is playing out. So next, let's look at a type B spot in a depolarized line where we're the turn aggressor. Again, I've created a makeshift river report here, and this time it's for a spot, again, an MTT spot, hijack big blind, except this time it's 7-6-4 rainbow on the flop, high frequency lead board for the big blind, but it does go check, check on the flop, and then the big blind on the 8 of clubs turn, so 4 to a straight on the turn with no flush draws. The big blind bets out for 33%, so a pro bet here of a fairly small sizing. And you can see here that on a lot of these rivers, there are very high frequencies of very small bets being used. You can see that even on a king, a queen, a jack, a lot of cards like that, there's 60-70% almost of block betting being done. And by contrast, there are certain very specific rivers where there's no block betting being done. And it's specifically a 5 or an ace. The ace being such a good card for the in-position player that the block bet doesn't achieve much. And the 5, putting 5 to a straight out there, putting a straight on the board, and now creating a scenario where both players are going to chop the pot a lot of the time. So if we again do the same thing and we pick out the most common spot here, the river card that has the highest percentage of blocking is the jack of clubs. So let's bring that one up and take a look at it. So here's the sim, and you can see the out of position player here is actually pretty much block betting their entire range at this point. They are betting 3.5, so 35% of pot with 40% of their range, and they're betting 10% with another 31% of their range. There are some overbets and some bigger bets kind of spread out across the range with some other portions of range here, but there's very, very little checking. And it's again going to come down to the equity distributions. So let's bring that up. You can see it looks very similar to the previous spot here. We've got a lot of middle to strong hands in this blue line here. There are a few trashy hands here, so it's not quite exactly the same. But really, again, it's putting a lot of pressure on these middling to weak hands, these 20-ish% equity hands that the in-position player has. The out-of-position does actually still have a nut advantage here. So there's a slight differentiation between this and the previous spot in that regard. But again, the in-position player has a lot of trash. They have a lot of stuff that's in that weak region. So we're up against a fairly weak range, and we're just trying to achieve indifference against some of the very bottom stuff in that range. So this 10% size, if we look at what the response is against 10%, the hands that are indifferent, you can see king high, queen high is indifferent between raising and folding. Some ace high is indifferent between raising, calling, and folding. Ace 10, ace 9, a lot of that stuff, again, is indifferent. Some hands are indifferent between raising as a bluff and folding now. Actually, some hands are also indifferent when it comes to raising for value, which is kind of interesting. So like aces, indifferent between raising for value and calling. So very interesting there. But generally, we're targeting a lot of pretty weak stuff, a lot of ace high that does still have reasonable equity. With the 35% sizing, the target is going to be a little bit further up. And if we go to filters, we can see it a little more easily here. And I'll just make it range length for everything. So we can see really it's ace high and even some low pair. There's a little bit of low pair in there that's actually slightly indifferent versus the 35%. Ace high, very indifferent for the most part, just kind of mixing calls and folds. So generally speaking, that's the way that this spot is panning out. It's similar to the previous one. It's a spot where out of position just has a lot of hands that have decent equity. In position's range is just very, very weak. And the small bet is just serving to apply pressure to the bottom of the in-position player's range. Let's now move on to looking at a type C spot. This is a depolarized line where we are the flop aggressor instead of the turn aggressor. In this case, we have another MTT spot, same stacks, except hijack button this time. We are out of position on a flop of 10-8-5 rainbow. We c-bet for just over half pot, get called. The turn is a king of spades, bringing a flush draw and an overcard, and then it goes check, check. So now we arrive at the river, and you can see here a lot of rivers are using a very high frequency of block betting here. There are plenty of rivers where almost half our range has an incentive to block bet. And this is where a lot of that range manipulation is coming into play, like I mentioned. The ability to slightly alter our checking range by having a blocking bet, in this case, is very, very powerful. And if we want to pick out the cards where it happens the most, well, the most frequent one here is going to be the 5 of diamonds. So at 59.3%, that's the highest frequency. So let's pull that one up and see what it looks like. So in this case, as you can see, again, we're not getting here with a massive number of combos, but it is about 25 to 30 combos, so it's not an insignificant number. And as you can tell, there's a certain amount of checking going on, but there are 2 different block sizes being used with certain frequencies here. We've got a 10% size and we've got a 34% size. So, kind of in that same territory, 1/3, and then, the very smallest size, or almost the very smallest size possible. And once again, it's going to come down to what the look of the ranges is. So here, it's a little bit different than before in that we're not necessarily as easily able to target a big portion of very weak hands here, but it is fairly similar in principle in that, as you can see, we now have a high frequency of trash hands in the button's range. The button does have 43 or 44% in that category of 25% equity or less. They do have some good hands now, which is slightly limiting how much blocking betting we can do. And we also have some nut hands, which gives us some incentive to use the larger sizes at some rate. But in general here, the distribution of hands is once again in a position where we have a pretty decent amount of good to strong hands, and then our opponent has quite a lot of trash. So it's just a situation where the block bets are putting pressure on that bottom of the range here. So if we look at how that's actually applying, let's go through the 10% node, do the same thing once again. The target here would seem to be the ace highs. Ace high is kind of indifferent here against the 10%, and low pair, 6s and 7s are pretty much pure call. So the 10% is kind of targeting ace high basically, and also targeting some of the no-made hand, kind of forcing it to bluff raise at some rate. And then the 34% is going to probably target slightly higher up in the range again. Yeah, you can see the 34% is now targeting low pair. It's now targeting 8x and 9s to some degree, which is kind of interesting. We've also got a lot of the low pairs that are now indifferent, like 7s is very close, 6s is close, 3s and deuces, mixing calls and raises there. So definitely targeting a slightly different region, but Once again, it's a small sizing that's used to apply pressure to a certain portion of hands and keep it indifferent. And that's a good example of a type C spot. Let's now look at a type D spot. This is actually a fairly common one. This is where we are defending the flop, we check call the flop, and then the turn checks through and we're out of position on the river. So this should be a very familiar example for you. Obviously, we've already looked at this spot a bunch, but this is the breakdown of the frequencies at which the block bets are used on each river card here. You can see this is not quite as much of a spot where the block bet is used at such a high rate. It has a little bit to do with the flop bet being 55% and in position still having a decently strong range in some aspects, considering the turn was a turn that some fairly strong hands are still going to want to check. But as you can see, there are plenty of spots here where the block bet is occurring, and the spot that we've already picked out, the Queen of Hearts, was one of the more common block bet spots. We've looked at that one quite a bit. 40% block bet frequency that's occurring. But let's also take a look at the second most here, which is the 10 of clubs. So let's break that one down and see if we can observe some similar trends. So this is the type D spot with the 10 of clubs on the river. As you can see, the 12% and the 35% are both still relatively prevalent, except maybe not a little bit, except maybe not as much as they were with the Queen of Hearts river. The 59% and the 82% are also being used a little bit more here, considering that we have a good chunk of 10x in our range that's just looking to value bet relatively big and get some value from that. So in the end, it's not quite the same sort of a spot just because there's a lack of draws that have completed on this river. It's given us trips instead, but it's the same principle here. If we look at the range distribution, again, it's a spot where we have a lot of fairly strong hands, or at least we have a lot of hands that are middle strength to strong kind of region, and in position has a lot of trash. They have a lot of hands that are in that weak category. Now it's important to distinguish here that when we talk about trash in these spots, we're not talking about just random like 8 high, absolutely nothing here necessarily. We're just talking about hands that are below 25% equity. And if we look at this region here, you can see that even some of the absolute bottom portions of villain's range, even some of the hands that just have like 7 high, etc., they're not 0 equity. And it's because sometimes we have like a 3 high flush draw with deuce 3 of hearts, and they actually have a tiny bit of equity, right? So in the end, we really don't have that many hands in villain's range that are so trashy that they just have no equity. And even hands like their ace highs, their king highs, a lot of that stuff that has some equity here is in that 10, 15-ish kind of percent region. So again, if we look at what's being targeted by the different parts of the strategy here, the indifferent region against the 12%, you can see it's a lot of low pair. In fact, it's actually kind of surprising here that something like 6-5 is fairly indifferent against 12%. I would assume that that's just because it loses to a 9 or a jack so often. The ace high is also indifferent there as well, particularly the weaker ace highs that unblock some potential bluffs, and the stronger ace highs that block some of the value. So that's kind of the region that's being targeted by 12%. And then the 35% is going to be doing a similar thing to what it was in the other spots. It's going to be targeting slightly further up, targeting a little bit of third pair, some 9x, but really 9x isn't folding. Low pair is going to be mostly the region that's very much targeted by that 35% sizing here. We're just putting a lot of villains' weakest sort of one pair hands in a lot of very awkward spots here. So that's basically what's happening. So again, it's a similar sort of a vibe. It's a similar sort of a approach where we are taking a spot that villain has a lot of fairly weak hands, and we're putting them in a really annoying sort of a spot against a very small bet where they might consider calling with those weak hands. They might consider bluff raising with them. And that, again, is that double or triple indifference that I mentioned earlier. So that's a type D spot. And finally, let's look at a type E spot. This is a pure passive line where both flop and turn get checked through. In this case, once again, it's a 50 big blind MTT spot. This time it's hijack big blind, and we've got a board of king 9-8 rainbow, jack of spades turn, and then we're just looking at the distribution of rivers here. You can see that there's a little bit less block betting going on here overall, just simply because this is a spot now where it's going to be the case that, for the most part, both players are lacking a lot of their strongest hands, And that, in turn, is going to kind of slightly neutralize the influence of the in-position player being a bit weaker, because now the out-of-position player is pretty weak as well. So the in-position player may not have quite as much trash in their range here, but nevertheless, there are going to be a good number of opportunities for out-of-position to block bet here. And the most common card, interestingly, is the one that completes all the draws, which is the Ace of Spades. So let's look at that one. So this is the Ace of Spades run out here on this King 9-8 Jack. And you can see there's obviously a lot of straights, flushes, two pairs, etc. out there, but neither player is really going to have that much of that to begin with at this point. We've got a sizing of 16% as the block sizing for out of position. Because the SPR is so significant at this point, the need for two different block sizings, or the ease of calculation within the solver of two block sizings, is a little bit reduced. So a sizing of 16% is fine as the sizing that we're just going to evaluate here. And you can see it is being used a certain amount, 150 combos or so, which is a pretty high frequency, considering a lot of these other spots are situations where we only have 20 or 30 combos in our range. In this case, you can see that a lot of the King X is choosing to block. A lot of the Ace X is considering blocking at some point, because it's a little bit harder for it to go bigger. And if we were to highlight the absolute strongest portions, there are going to be some flushes in there, but not a ton. There are going to be some nut flushes that are blocking to get raised, some nut flushes that are checking. Just depends on card removal, as we mentioned before. So if we break down the equity distributions once again, you can see this one's a little bit different, because again, as I mentioned, the fact that out of position has now checked twice also neutralizes the strength of their range to some degree. So both players now have a fair amount of trash, and it's not quite as favorable of a situation for out of position to block bet. But of course, that does mean that there's some good hands, some weak hands, some best hands. The distribution is definitely going to be pretty broad, and neither of the two ranges is going to be in a particularly favorable spot here. But card removal is going to have an impact, as we've already said. And we're also going to see that there are still plenty of hands in villain's range that are going to be indifferent versus certain bet sizes. So if we look at, again, the 16% size here, which is the only real small bet size that's being used, or the only block sizing that's being used, we can see that for the most part, again, it's low pairs. There's no ace high now, obviously, because there's an ace on the board, but it's low pairs. It's queen 8, 7, 6s, 5s, 4s, 3s, deuces, all those low pocket pairs. Those are now pretty much indifferent versus a bet, because if we look at the equity that they have, if we sort by equity here, you can see a hand like even deuces has 11.7% equity here, or even sevens has 12.3% equity. And those hands are in some awkward spots versus that 16% bet size, just because of how good of a price they're getting. So this, once again, is a spot where, even though the block bet sizing is not as prevalent as it was in some of the other situations where out of position really had a lot of good hands, but not that many nut hands in their range, this is a spot where block betting can come in just simply as a versatile tool to alter our checking range slightly and create some indifference for certain hands in the in-position range that otherwise would have a fairly easy check if we were to just check. So that about wraps up the type E spots. So now that we've identified the main types of spots in which block betting occurs, let's summarize what we've learned in this video. In general, block betting is a very common part of the out-of-position river game tree, especially in depolarized lines with limited betting action. The idea behind this strategy as a whole is that it achieves several things at once. It keeps certain parts of our opponent's range indifferent in various ways at the same time, and alters the nature of our checking range. Some of the old-fashioned logic surrounding block betting does have some merit, but range construction is very important as always. We're never doing anything exclusively with one type of hand. When we're looking for spots to employ block bets, we should find spots where our range contains a limited amount of trashy hands, and/or both players can easily have a lot of second and third pair hands. And in particular, this tends to occur on somewhat connected boards where the river completes one or more draws. And I would also look out for situations where our opponent has a lot of hands that have 10, 20, 25% equity that we can put in those indifferent spots. That's going to be it for this video. I hope you got a lot out of it. If you'd like more on this topic, you can check out Tomboss's free article titled The Initial Better's Advantage that I mentioned earlier, and Solo Costa's coaching session on depolarized strategies, which is available with a GTO Wizard subscription. If you have any specific questions about this video, please feel free to reach out to me via the GTO Wizard Discord server, where I'll be happy to answer them. Thanks everybody for watching, and good luck.